Yesterday, we read in the parsha the story of the Akeidas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, which is one of the most important aspects of our history, of our lineage, of our liturgy. Of course, specifically around Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we talk around Rosh Hashanah. We talk about it a lot, but on a daily basis, we read those verses, and in the words of the Abar Benel on his commentary to the Akeidah, Haparsha Hazois, this parsha, this section, he called Keren Yisrael, is the entire, how would you translate Keren, the entire pride, let's say, of the Jewish people, and their merit in front of their Father in heaven. And this is why it is fluent or common in our prayers on every day, or all day. So, a number of questions that Jewish thinkers and philosophers over the generations have raised, and I think some aspects of this are also, at least personally, pertinent in the situation we find ourselves in right now with everything that we're seeing in the news. So let's boil it down to two primary questions. Number one, why is the Akeidah more significant than any other form of any other of the other stories and episodes of mesirus nefesh, of which there are many hundreds and thousands throughout the generations of people who gave up their lives to remain loyal to Hashem? And one could even make the argument to the contrary. Not only are all of those other stories as significant as the Akeidah, but perhaps they are even more significant, because whereas Avraham Avinu had a direct command from Hashem to go and do this, Hashem communicated with him directly, this is what I want you to do. In later generations, not only was there no command, but on the contrary, it came usually at times of great concealment of Hester Panim, where Hashem's presence was the most concealed. And specifically at those times, we have all these stories of the Kedoshim throughout the generations who gave their lives to remain loyal to Hashem. Surely there's an argument to be made that we should be focusing more on that than on Avraham Avinu, who had a direct command from Hashem to do so. Second question, why do we focus, we call it Akeidas Yitzchak, but yet we're focused very much on the schus of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, he is the hero of the story in the Akeidah, and somehow Yitzchak, no offense, Yitzchak gets a little bit pushed to the wayside. So this question, specifically the first question, is perhaps first found echoed in the famous story of what we call Chana v'Shiva Banaho. It's a story that's found in many places. I'll read you the beginning and end of the story as it's found in the Gemara in Gittin, where it says there was a woman. It doesn't say her name was Chana in the Gemara, but it just says a woman and her 7 sons who were brought in front of the Caesar, and he told them to bow to the idol, and one by one, each one of the 7 children gave their lives, and the Caesar tried to trick them, just pick up the ring, just pick up the coin, just do this, just do that, but every single one of the 7, from the oldest to the youngest, was killed by the Roman who wanted to make them bow to the idol. And then at the end of the story, the Gemara says, she says, my son or my sons, L'chu ve'imru la'Avram avichem, go and tell Avram your father, Ato akaduto mizbeach echad, you, akaduto literally means to bind, but you did one mizbeach, you gave one of your children for Hashem, V'ani akaduti shiva mizbechais, and I did 7. So already here, we find the first allusion or reference to this concept that here Chana is saying, so to speak, to Avraham Avinu, why do you think you're so special? This is even more. So, moving on in the generations, one of the very important Jewish philosophers by the name of Rabbi Yosef Albo, Spanish rabbi, 14th century, and he has a famous sefer called the Sefer HaIkrim, Ikrim. And in Sefer HaIkrim, it's a Maimer Gimel Perek Lamed Vav. He talks about the love for Hashem. What does love for Hashem mean? He talks about this at great length. And he has a very interesting take on a Gemara. Where the Gemara says that, and Rashi actually quotes this on his commentary to the Chumash, where it says, Kach noes bincha, please take your son. Avram, so Hashem says, please take your son. Why is he saying please? So Chazal teach us because Avram could have a good response. Avram could say, look, you promised me that I was going to have progeny. Yitzchak is the fulfillment of that promise. So I'm sorry, it's not really a good idea for me to go and kill him now. So Yitzchak could have said, Avram could have said that, and that's why Hashem says, please, Kachno, please do this. So the Sefer Yikrim, he learns Pshat in this Gemara differently. I mean, I had never. Why is Hashem saying please? Not every time Hashem asks somebody to do something does he say please. He says to Moshe, go speak to the Jewish people. He doesn't always say please. Why is he saying please? Because this is an extra difficult thing to do. Okay. But the Sefer Yikrim says no. What that means is that Hashem really wasn't telling him to do it. Hashem was just asking him, would you mind? And Avram had the free choice to say no, and God would have been totally fine with that. In the words of the Ikrim, Sha'afilu mitzad mitzvahs Hashem Yisbarach, even because of the command, so to speak, of Hashem, Lo haya Avram muchrach, Avram was not compelled, Achash ha'yochel, he's not saying he could have gotten out of it. I mean, b'taina amitis, with a true, with a real claim, imratza, if he wanted to. V'lo also came, he did not do so. Kovash rachmi ha'aval haben liyavas Hashem. He, so to speak, conquered, he overcame the natural mercy of a father on his son for the sake of the love of Hashem. And then he finishes off with an answer to the two questions which we started with. This is why we attribute the Akeidah to Avraham and not to Yitzchak. Even though according to Chazal, the Yitzchak was already 37 years old at the Akeidah, he wasn't a young child. There is also another opinion, the Ben Ezra, I believe, strongly supports the opinion that he was a young teenager. But the Chazal's opinion is that he was 37 years old, so surely he was an adult, and obviously he could have he protested, but so if he didn't, that means we had his full cooperation. So why are we attributing this more to Avram than to Yitzchak? Lefi, Avram could have gotten out of it because Hashem said, please do this. He could have said no. Whereas Yitzchak had no choice to get out of it because it was Hashem told him to do so. This is the reason this is why we mention in our prayers constantly the binding of Avram, that Avram bound Yitzchak, more than the binding, than the mesirus nefesh of all the holy and pious ones who gave their life for sanctification of Hashem's name over the generations, and Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, and all the martyrs from every generation. Each one of them, indeed, they gave their life for Hashem, and that's amazing. But they were doing so to fulfill what? To fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment, the obligation which they had no legitimate way to get out of sanctifying Hashem's name. Whereas Avraham, who had the choice not to, and he did it voluntarily, that is why the Akeidah is so special. That's why we talk about it all the time, and that's why we attribute it more to Avraham than to Yitzchak. Similarly, in the Drashis Haran, Rav Nissen of Grona, also Sfardi, a little bit later, I believe. The Drashis Haran has actually recently been published and translated by Art Scroll. It's in the library, 2 volumes of the Drashis Haran. So in Drush Vav, Drashis Haran is the Ran's is 12 or 13 of the Ran's sermons, which he himself transcribed. And in Drush number 6, he says like this. Hayoser rochik min hateva Avram would not have been punished at all had he not agreed to do the Akeidah. Hashem did not command him to do so. Hashem had already promised him that Yitzchak would be his progeny. This is why it says, please take your son. We know that this means it's not a commandment, it's a request. Hashem showed him that it would please Hashem, it would be good in Hashem's eyes if Avram would please be so kind to forgive me, Hashem, on my promise that Yitzchak would be your progeny and bring him as a carbon. Avram didn't use any of these what would have been legitimate excuses. And that is why we extol so strongly the virtue of the Akeidah. So this is the typical approach to the question that we find in the medieval Jewish philosophers. Again, the examples we've given from Rabbi Yosef Albo and the Ran. One of the shortcomings, if you will, of this approach is the fact that, the example that the Sefer HaYikarim gives is Rabbi Kiva v'Chaveirov, the great rabbis who we talk about in Asar HaRugamalchos, who were persecuted by the Romans. But certainly, throughout the generations, we have tremendous precedent for other people who gave their lives for mesirus nefesh v'Kiddush Hashem at a time where there was not a commandment to do so. And not only was there not a commandment to do so, it's actually halachically questionable whether it was legitimate. And we've discussed this in the past, we touched upon this briefly this past Tisha B'Av in the Kinnos that reference this, and we've discussed it in the past in the Sunday morning class a few years ago. The idea that there were people who were confronted with situations where, according to halacha, they were not obligated to give their lives. And in some cases, not only did they give their lives, in the cases where they were not obligated to do so, they even gave other people's lives where it was they were killing each other or killing young children so that they should not have to face the torture which they may or may not have been able to withstand, of being coerced to convert to Christianity or things along those lines. And we find specifically the Beis Yosef in his elaborates on this in his commentary to Yeridea, to the Torah Yeridea, Simon Kufton Zion, chapter 157, where he gives a summary of all the different opinions and literature about this. Of course, in recent times, a lot more has been written on this. But he basically brings sources where we find it's permissible, that in certain cases it's permissible to give one's life, even if it's not halachically mandated. It's not the opinion of the Rambam. The Rambam holds that if halachically you're allowed to transgress a certain avera, then you're not allowed to give your life for it. But many Rishonim argue on the Rambam, and they held that it would be a voluntary fulfillment of the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And he even brings justification in certain cases for people having killed their own children to have them avoid facing the torture, and that's the extreme limits of it, where it's very questionable. But he even brings the Rishonim, the Orchos Chaim, I believe, who deduces from the Gemara that to kill oneself, because you know that if you don't take your own life, you're going to face torture to convert to another religion. And you know that you're not going to be able to handle that torture, and you might snap under that torture, that it would be permissible to take one's own life. But anyway, the upshot of all of this is that clearly the fact that the Rabbi Tam famously writes about this, the fact that the Poskim talk about this so much, it's clear that this was a somewhat common occurrence. You're talking about later in history than the Romans, of course. This is something that became much more relevant around the times of the Crusades. But certainly there were many people in our history of our ancestors who gave their lives voluntarily al Kiddush Hashem. And if the entire virtue of Avraham Avinu and the Akeidah is that Avraham Avinu did the mesirus nefesh to give his son when he wasn't, so to speak, obligated to, because he could have turned back to Hashem and said, you promised me, and Hashem would have said, okay. So then are we going to now say, well, now after we have all this precedent by the Crusades, etc., are we going to say, well, actually now we have other things that are perhaps more special than the Akeidah? And so we have Chassidus introduces a concept called Psichas HaTzinor. Psichas HaTzinor literally means to open the pipe. One of the first appearances of this concept is actually attributed to the Beis Yosef actually himself, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Beis Yosef had a teacher from the higher worlds who was called the Maggid, and the Beis Yosef. So the Beis Yosef is famous for his commentary on the Torah. The Beis Yosef, he's the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He has the commentary of the Rambam, the Kesef Mishnah. One of the Beis Yosef's Sfarim is the Maggid Meisharim, in which he transcribes his meetings with his teacher, the Maggid. And so we find in the Sefer Chomas Anoch from the Chidah, in his commentary to Mishle chapter 3, where he writes that one time the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, was struggling with a very difficult Rambam, and for many days he did not find an answer to understand this Rambam. Remember, Reuven, we discussed about a Shvera Rambam? So the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was for many days struggling to try and understand the Rambam. One day, it was early in the morning, and suddenly he found a suitable answer to explain the Rambam, and he was very excited and very happy about this. The next day, he's giving his daily class to his students, and he tells, last night, Hashem gave me the tremendous merit to understand this Rambam. And he presents the Rambam, the question, and before he gets a chance to answer it, there was a very young scholar in the room, a newbie, and he says, if you don't mind, could I just tell you what I think about this Rambam? And this young newbie gets up, and he says this very answer that the Beis Yosef had worked on for so many days and nights to try and address this answer, this Rambam, this young Talmud Chacham, he was able to, he came up with the same answer. And Rabbi Yosef Karo tells him, Baruch atah l'shamayim, blessed are you to heaven, this is indeed the truth, and everybody was very happy. However, the Beis Yosef himself, nitztair mishakol kach tarachu, like, well, how is it that I'm the teacher, right? How is it that it took me so long to come up with something that this young lad, he was able to come with right away? And so his teacher, the Maggid, says to him, Al titztair, don't have pain. You merited to be very, to toil greatly. And through your great toil, all these days and nights, you managed to reach the truth. And until that day that you did so, nobody else was able to truly get to the depth of those words of the Rambam. After you toiled and you brought to light the truth depth of this Rambam, now every Chacham is able to understand it. You introduced this pshat in the Rambam to the world, and that's how that young aspiring Talmud Chacham was able to call him an Avir, he was able to catch the ball. So there's this idea, sort of a thing. The idea is that there's spiritual koiches, spiritual realities that need to break the barrier and be introduced into the atmosphere of the world, and that's really hard to make it break through into the atmosphere. And it's once that's happened, then it becomes accessible to other people as well. So in this vein, I'm going to read to you a few lines from a mimer of the Rebbe Rashab. This is a mimer in Tofresh Ayin Ches. I don't remember the Dibra Maschel. I didn't put it on my notes, but it's there, and it's in a number of places in Chassidus as well. I just chose one of the places where it says it. Says the Rebbe, this is why in the Zohar often we find that the Zohar starts with, when someone introduces that so-and-so said something, it doesn't say he said it, it says he opened it. That this sage, by teaching this teaching, he opened let's use the terminology we've been using, he broke that concept into the atmosphere. The kasha pesach hatzinev and nimshach haskola yochel gam achar lahamtzi haskola. Now somebody else also would have access to that concept. Mashenkin and loyav niftach hatzinev. If that original sage had not done so, nobody else would have access to it. Or kamei b'dorah de B'Shem ben Yochai, like in the generation of B'Shem ben Yochai, afilu yunuki gilus isri Torah. Even young children were able to reveal secrets of the Torah. Because B'Shem ben Yochai gave everybody access to that. And now, here comes the relevance to our point. This is why we always reference the Akeidas Yitzchak. We find in the time of the Second Temple much greater mesirus nefesh than Avraham Avinu. Like the story we mentioned from the Gemara earlier of Chana and her 7 children, and in recent generations, there were many stories of mesirus nefesh for sanctifying Hashem, over Yisurim Gedolim and Eroim Rachman and Litzan, with tremendous, awesome torture. Avraham is the one who opened the pipe. Yeah, he brought mesirus nefesh into the atmosphere of this world. Until Avraham, there was no such thing as mesirus nefesh. Avraham Avinu alav hashalom hayu harishin shemotza nafshei al rotzon Hashem shapasach hatzatziner. He was the first person to do so and open it, give access to everybody to it. And this is why we constantly mention Akeidas Yitzchak. Okay, so let's summarize the story so far. What we're saying is that why is mesirus nefesh of Avraham so special? Well, we have the Sefer Yikrim and the Ran saying that it was somewhat voluntary. We don't need to. We could still incorporate that in our perspective, but still, even though there were other people who may have done things which were somewhat voluntary, the point is Avraham is the first one who created this reality. He brought this reality of mesirus nefesh into the atmosphere. And then, now, we all, as descendants and Yershim and inheritors of Avraham Avinu, we have access to that idea. Now, Chassidus explains that at the end of the day, the idea of giving one's life, in English, giving one's own life, the crass word for it is suicide. And if you say suicide, then that brings to mind all sorts of other things of people who give their lives for all sorts of things. So what makes the mesirus nefesh, when we talk about the fact that we have mesirus nefesh, that we, in the famous words of Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe, that a Yid neither wants nor is able to separate himself from Hashem. What makes that so unique? And I think that in Chassidus we could generally say 4 or 5 different approaches that we find throughout Chassidus to this question. There's a sefer called Beis Rabbi. Beis Rabbi is written by a certain Rabbi Halman, and it's a history of the first 3 generations of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, and Tzemach Tzedek. And in that sefer, he brings the following story. He says that, this is not so politically correct, but he says that in order to be accepted into the Maggid's inner circle of his students, not everybody was accepted. You had to be only very special people were accepted. However, he says, don't think that the people who weren't accepted were just your regular simple folk. Even the simple folk had tremendous levels of Akeidas Hashem. So he says an example. He says there were these 3 people who they were quote unquote the simple folk. They would come to heat up the ovens. I think in contemporary language we would say they were plumbers. And he says that these plumbers were very great people. He says one time the Alter Rebbe, who was one of the students of the Maggid, was was resting, so maybe they thought he was sleeping, but he actually heard this conversation between the three of them, and they started out. He said that one of them asked, "What's the big deal that Hashem gave that Avram gave his son to Hashem? Who wouldn't do that if they had a direct command from Hashem? Hashem communicated with him," and he said, by the way, it's of note, I think we've probably also mentioned this in the past, the Rambam writes in Mer Nevuchim that he says the word Nisa es Avraham, the word Nisayan, according to the Rambam, doesn't mean like we usually translate it to mean a test, but rather it means to create a role model, a paradigm, and that there's a lesson from the Akeidah that is relevant to all future generations. The Rambam actually in that chapter in Mer Nevuchim says two lessons, but the one that's relevant to our discussion here is he says that what you see from the Akeidah is that when Hashem communicates with a human being, prophecy, there's no ifs and buts to it. It's 100% clear. He says, how do you know? Because if Avram would have had any doubt that maybe he was hallucinating, there's no way he would have done it. It must have been 100% clear communication, and that's why Avram waits 3 days. It takes him 3 days to get there, so there shouldn't be nobody should be able to come and say, oh, Avram was just dreaming and he was having, he was high on something. The communication is 100% clear. So that's what they're asking is, hey, if you have direct communication from Hashem telling you to do so, who would not do it? And so one of them answers, oh, no, you know what's so special about Avraham Avinu? What's so special about Avraham Avinu is that he grew up in Terach's house. Everybody else throughout the generations who had mesirus nefesh, who would have mesirus nefesh, you had the Yiddish chinuch, you were educated, you learned Torah, you learned Chassidus, so of course you're going to, but somebody who grew up in the most, in pagan headquarters, in the house of Terach, who was able to make such a 180 and turn around to serve Hashem, that is what's so special about Avraham Avinu.
What about Rabbi Akiva?
He didn't have a Torah upbringing, but it wasn't as bad as Terach, I think we could say. Anyway, but Akiva over here, our Akiva, and also some of the other plumbers over there, they did not like this answer, and so the second one said no. The chiddush is not that he went and shechted his son. The chiddush is the zrizos. This is actually referenced by the Alter Rebbe in the Geras Akeidas Shemin Chaf Aleph in Tanya, that Melo, you go, Hashem tells you, okay, so of course I'm going to do what Hashem wants, but the fact that he wakes up bright and early at the crack of dawn, and he goes and does it with such excitement and such as Jesus, that is what makes the Akeidah so special. But the third one also, the third in the plumber, he didn't like this answer either. And he said, no, I'll tell you what's so special about Avraham Avinu. What's so special about Avraham Avinu's Akeidah is that even afterwards, he says, the Pasuk says, that this is that you didn't. He says that you didn't withhold your son from me. He says the word mimeni from me is superfluous. The pasuk would have made sense without it. But rather, he says the pasuk is testifying that even after the Akeidah, the simcha, the joy of Avram was not, oh, my son Yitzchak survived this ordeal. Rather, V'nisha b'chaim and remained alive. Kiyim rather, shagam oz somach, even after the whole Akeidah, what was Avram Avinu's simcha? What was he happy about? What made his day? Shekiyim mitzvah Hashem yisbarach shaloi l'shachtoi, that he fulfilled the mitzvah to not shecht Yitzchak. So his own, and this is really points. We'll discuss it, uncover it a little bit more. But this is really the crux of the Chassidus perspective to mesirus nefesh, that nothing has any value to me whatsoever, even the most intrinsic, basic human feelings of love and care from a father to all of those things which are engraved into our DNA. All of that means absolutely nothing to me in contrast to my relationship with Hashem. Right? Again, these are certainly mirroring the words of the Ikrim, the love of Hashem, more than the love of his son, but perhaps more in the style of Chassidus. And it says the Alter Rebbe finished off and says, that each one of these people, they weren't just saying it's a good pshat, a good, I have a good question, I have a better question, I have a good answer. They were actually saying, this is where they were at in Avodas Hashem. The first guy, his level of Avodas Hashem was, I'm not going to go to my therapist's couch and blame everything on my father. I'm gonna take responsibility for my own issues in life, right? Okay. The second one has the zriza, and the third one was on this level. And by the way, it's interesting to note that this third pshat, at least a very similar pshat, I don't know if it's exactly the same, but it's a very, very similar pshat, is found in Kedushas Levi and Pashas Vayera. Now, we're not the person who said it in the story is not Rabbi Yitzchak of Bardisha, but it's interesting that it made it into there. So, but Akapadim, the point is that this third one is saying, Avram Simcha, what Avram cares more about is not that I managed to have my son survive. What he cares even more about is that I fulfill the mitzvah. Which mitzvah? Don't shecht your son. You know, it's like we talk about Oinus Rahmana Patri, that sometimes a person's in a situation where he's not able to do a certain mitzvah, whatever it is. Okay, you're Oinus, it's circumstances beyond your control. But how do you feel about it? Do you feel, thank God I wasn't able to do that. That would have been so inconvenient. Or is your real simcha from being able to fulfill a mitzvah from Hashem, and you feel disappointed when you're not able to do it? Or in this case, the simcha is from that he was able to fulfill the mitzvah, not to shecht his son. Anyway, so already here we see. Already here. So far what we've seen is specifically from this story of the plumbers, the HVAC, it's not plumbing, it's HVAC. The HVAC members of the Maggid's household was, first of all, the idea that Avram grew up in Terach's house and was able to make such a 180. Secondly, the zrizos, that he did it with enthusiasm and excitement. And thirdly, the most sublime of those three, that he was able to, that his simcha, that he rejoiced not in sparing his son's life, but in fulfilling the mitzvah of Hashem. Staying within the school of the students of the Maggid, there is one of the most senior students of the Maggid, whose name was Ramendel Vitebsker, otherwise known as Ramendel Haradakar, and he was the leading student of the Maggid, who he became the leader after the Maggid's passing, and later when he moved to Eretz Yisrael, so then the Alter Rebbe sort of took over his position, at the same time as undertaking the responsibility to support those who had gone to Eretz Yisrael with Ramendel Haradaka. So that's why you have all those letters in Tanya fundraising money for Eretz Yisrael. That was the Alter Rebbe's position, where he had committed to doing so. So this Ramendel Vitebsker, Ramendel Haradaka, he has a sefer called Pri Haaretz. And in Pri Haaretz, he starts off in his commentary to Pashas Vayera with these two questions. Why is the Nesoyin Akeidah, why do we attribute it to Avraham Avinu and not to Yitzchak? And he also says, why don't we make a big deal of Avraham Avinu's Nesoyin in Ur Kasdim many years earlier, when Nimrod again challenged his commitment to Hashem and to monotheism, and Nimrod threw him into the fiery furnace. So why is that not mentioned explicitly in the Torah? Anyway, so he has quite a long shtickle, a long piece in his style. But let me read to you the relevant piece, and I think that I personally find this very relevant nowadays. V'hinei, I'm going to read and translate a few lines inside. Nesoyin Akeidah, the test of the Akeidah, who Midrashim and Rashi is all it's brought by in the Midrashim and Rashi. Shahayel Avram l'hayra achim midosav, that it would have been sensible, or it would have made sense for Avram to doubt Hashem's behavior. This is what Rabbi says. Avram says to Hashem, let me talk this out with you. Yesterday, meaning previously, you told me that Yitzchak is going to be my progeny. Then you said, go and take your son and shecht him. Now you're telling me, don't shecht him. So Avram would have been excused for thinking that Hashem can't make up his mind. It seems that Hashem keeps on vacillating and changing his mind, which is the root for all heresy. All the questions that we have of tzaddik v'raloi, of righteous people suffering, the opposite of what would be appropriate, that righteous people should prosper, and the promises of the Torah, that people who fulfill the Torah will be rewarded with plentiful. Shar kushas or other questions, amunas akeidas and heretical beliefs. Asher azelu mazal likim neged kol dveikus vasagus amitusa bechachmose. I'm skipping a few words. Aval Avram Avinu Aval Avshalom Amid bin Isoyin. Avram Avinu remained strong in his test. He did not have second thoughts in his belief in Hashem and in Hashem changing his mind. And he strengthened himself with the true faith very strongly of Hashem's will. That human thoughts are not the same or cannot comprehend divine thoughts. We cannot understand Hashem's ways at all. And that Avram strengthens himself with the knowledge and the conviction that all the things that seem to be bad, that come from Hashem, are in reality good. Everything comes from Hashem is good, and anything that seems to be the opposite of this is our shortcoming, that we are as puny mortals are not able to understand this. No human comprehension can fathom Hashem, or as sometimes it's brought in Chassidus, if you understand it, then that by definition means that it's not God, etc. Of Amunah Zu, and with this faith, his chazik Avram Avinu alav Shalom, Avram Avinu strengthened himself. He didn't rely on his own perception, and he withstood the test not to doubt Hashem. Klala de Milsa, summary of the whole thing. Ikra Nisyon is all of the primary of all Nisyonis, of all tests that we face. Heim ba'amunah are there to challenge our faith. The pasuk says, "And Ekev l'nasoyuscha l'das es Hashem b'vavcha." V'chala nisyonis shoyel Avram Avinu hayu al derech zeh. All of the tests that Avram Avinu had were along this vein. Like the famine. First Hashem tells him to go to the land of Canaan. Then it appears that Hashem is changing his mind by bringing in a famine and forcing him to go down to Egypt. All the other tests. mesirus nefesh just giving your life, says the Mendel Vitebsk, just giving your life for Hashem. Once you know that there's one God, so obviously you're going to give your life for Him. That's not a nisayon, and even if it's a nisayon for people like us, it's certainly not a nisayon, not a challenge for the people on the caliber of Avram Avinu. And certainly for having had direct communication from Hashem. But rather, the reason we make such a big deal about the Akeidah is where it was the epitome, all of the 10 tests of Avram Avinu, he says, but specifically the Akeidah is the epitome where Avram could have had every excuse in the book to doubt Hashem. What's this business of Hashem changing his mind every day? And yet, he remains strong in his steadfast belief in Hashem, in the truth of Hashem, that all the anything that I don't understand is because of my own shortcomings. And that is what is the lesson and the takeaway from the Akeidah, strengthening in our belief that all the terrible things that are happening in the world, that it's hard to say it. Yeah. I spend more time watching the news than I should, but there was one of the videos was the mother. There's one of the hostages, a young girl who was released, who the soldiers freed her. So there was this video going around of seems like a few days or sometime before that. Her mother was doing the mitzvah of hafrashas challah, and in so doing, she was davening, asking Hashem to send her daughter home. And in you can see it's not, she's not reading a script, she's talking from her heart, right? And in the middle she sort of blurts out like, Hashem, I love you. if you understand the Hebrew, right? And it's just like. So the story so far, again, we have the teachings of the Ran and the Sefer and the Sefer Yikrim that the Akeidah was somewhat voluntary. It was Avram's absolute love to Hashem. We have Chassidus teaching us the idea that Avram is what brought the concept of mesirus nefesh into access of all of us. We have four ideas coming from the house of the Maggid, from his lead Talmud, Ramendel Haradaka, and from the three HVAC plumbers. Number one, that the Akeidah was that he didn't doubt Hashem. Number two, that it was the fact that he grew up in the house of Terach and was still able to accomplish this. Number two, the zrizus, the enthusiasm. And number four, the fact that with everything said and done, what Avraham Avinu gave him simcha was the fact that not that his son survived, but the fact that he fulfilled the mitzvah to not shecht Yitzchak. The Gemara says, and Rashi paraphrases this in his commentary to the Chumash, and we've already seen half of this Gemara quoted by some of the Sfarim that we've quoted until now. I'm reading you the Gemara Sanhedrin Peitas Amid Beis. Amar Shimon ben Abba, Ein no elo loshin bakosha. The word no means please. Moshel lemelech basav adam. A analogy of a human king. She'amdu lefanav milchamis harbi. There were many battles that he faced. He had one general, one powerful general who won all of them. One day, he had an extra strong battle that he faced. And he says to his general, please, withstand this test, so that people shouldn't say that the first battles were nothing. In other words, that you're not really such a special general, and it's just that those wars were so easy, that's why you won them. Similarly, Hashem says to Avram, I have tested you with many tests. You withstood all of them. Please withstand this final test for me, so that they, the naysayers, shouldn't say that that the first ones were nothing. Ein mamash literally means that they were not tangible, meaning there was nothing to them. So the Rebbe points to this Gemara to say, okay, it's all, we've got all these teaching of Chassidus telling us what's so special about the Akeidah, but still, to come and say that Ein Mamash B'Rishonim, say, look, Avraham Avinu, you were so good, you passed test 1, you passed test 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. 10 was too hard for you. If 10 was too hard, does that make the first 9 be nothing? Why would the claim be that if Avraham did not withstand the test of the Akeidah, that now everybody would come and say that Ein Mamash B'Rishonim, that there is no substance to have Avraham Avinu as having overcome the first 9 tests?
Maybe those tests weren't hard for him.
I mean, being thrown into the fiery furnace.
He would like something he would have done naturally, but to kill his son, okay, that's the limit. That's the limit for Abraham. And so
Right.
He wasn't tested in that way, so none of them really meant that much to Abraham.
No, we're not saying it doesn't mean too much to Avraham. One moment, we're saying it doesn't mean too much to Hashem. What the Gemara seems to be saying is that if Avraham, that had Chas v'Shalom Avraham not withstood the test of the Akeidah, that everything Avraham had overcome until then, the challenge of Sarah and the challenge of the famine and all the challenges until then, including the first most powerful one, perhaps, of having to go into the fiery furnace to overcome the debate with Nimrod, all of that has no substance. Ein b'hamamish, those are worth nothing.
I don't agree with that. I mean, it's all relative to the situation at the time and the circumstances.
Right.
Right? So you're at a different stage of your life. You're at a different situation where, your wife is threatened, you're younger. Here it's later with your son. It's different circumstances, different timing. So I would, in evaluating which of the tests are more difficult, just on the surface, I think you have to analyze the situation at each time, each moment, and appreciate how difficult it was at that time, given the circumstances.
That's precisely the Rebbe's question. How could the Gemara come and say that if Avram would not withstand the Nisayon of the Akeidah, we would say everything else has no substance? Everything else was very valuable. Those were very difficult things to do.
Oh, is that what the Gemara
says? The Gemara says that if you don't pass the test of the Akeidah, they will say that all the others had no substance to them. In other words, the fact that you overcame the other 9 tests is meaningless.
Well, who's they?
Well, they could be the naysayers. It could be whether it means the Satan or it means the nations of the world, the pagan cultures that were around at the time. I don't know who the they is, but I don't know that it's relevant to the concept.
It's not us.
It seems to be indicating that everything else
It's
is
not
just
the Rishonim
preparation.
who are. It's not the Rishonim.
No. Ein mamash b'rishonim means the first test. The first of the. If you don't withstand test number 10, then the Rishonim, the first 9 tests, are going to be attributed by the naysayers to nothing. Oh, that was no big deal.
That those aren't really tests; they're just preparation for one test in the end, right?
So, one second. So, I think, Steve, you're saying that you agree, that you identify with the Rebbe's question.
Identify with the question, and those who are the naysayers, I think, are not thinking it through.
Oh, very good. So Steve and the Rebbe are aligned over here. That's always a good thing.
Now
Okay.
you're scaring me.
Okay. Who knows who Socrates was?
Greek philosopher.
Greek philosopher. What's Socrates' end?
Poisoned by hemlock.
Why was
Did
he
you
was?
say end?
What was his end? So I'll read to you what it says in Wikipedia, which is of course 100% accurate. Socrates was a Greek philosopher from Athens in 399 BC. He was formerly accused of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and for worshipping false gods and failing to worship the gods of Athens. At the trial, he defended himself unsuccessfully. The jurors ordered the death penalty. There were 2 main sources for the religion-based accusation. First, he had rejected the anthropomorphism of traditional Greek religion by denying that gods did bad things like humans do, and Socrates was given the chance to offer alternative punishments. Anyway, basically, he was put to death. Okay, so there is a chassid by the name of Rabbi Chitrik who wrote transcribed his memories from Lubavitch. So in Lubavitch, there was a mashpia by the name of Rabbi Shmuel Groenem Esteban, and Rabbi Shmuel Groenem told the following story. He said that the Alter Rebbe so Rabbi Shmuel Groenem was quoting the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe says that when Socrates came to heaven, he said to the heavenly court, "I deserve a seat right up there next to Avraham Avinu." He says, Avraham Avinu gave his life to sanctify belief in one God, and so did I. So give me a seat right where I deserve it. And to Socrates' great dismay, the heavenly court said, "No, you do not compare to Avraham Avinu, because Avraham Avinu gave his life without any reason or for reward, rather only because of his pure belief in Hashem. But you," and the way the story goes, he says it in Yiddish, "you understood du hast verbitten a taiva of a taiva," that you substituted one pleasure for another pleasure. In other words, you recognized with your own logic the truth of one God, and the pleasure of living life was not as pleasurable as as perpetuating the truth. In other words, we're not, again, I'm certainly no expert on the history of Socrates, but the point is that here we have, lahavdil alaf alfi havdalis, the people who give their lives for the most crass things, which we're reading about in the news. But here you have a person who's a philosopher, who's, so to speak, giving his life because he wants to perpetuate that actually all this anthropomorphic pagan ideas of the Greeks are false, and he wants to perpetuate a monotheistic belief in this world. That's true. That's amazing, but it doesn't compare to what Avraham Avinu did. Why doesn't it compare to what Avraham Avinu did? Because at the end of the day, you're making the logical calculation. Look, I have 2 choices. I could live a life paying lip service to the Greek gods, or I could not have to suffer that and bring an end to my suffering by accepting the death penalty. And not only will you bring an end to your suffering, but also you'll have an everlasting impact in the world. And again, no expert on the history of philosophy, but I'm sure that Socrates did in some way pave the road for the world that we have today, which is certainly much more monotheistic than it was back in those days in Greece. So says the Alter Rebbe to Socrates, "Du hast verbitten a taiva for taiva." All you did was you gave up the ice cream for the roller coaster. You gave up one pleasure for another pleasure. Whereas Avraham Avinu's mesirus nefesh is something which defies all logic. Socrates' mesirus nefesh, so to speak, is the product of logic. Avraham Avinu's mesirus nefesh defies logic.
I've come across this story a couple times. Don't remember exactly where, if it's Chassidus or somewhere else, but this person is studying Gemara and trying to figure out this sugya, and it takes him months and months and months. Finally, he has this very unique understanding of it. Okay, then the next day he goes to show and he sees a couple young bachram.
Isn't that the story we read before from the Chidor with the Rebbe of Karo?
Oh, is that?
Yeah, I mean it sounds like the same story and there was different.
Okay, so maybe all right.
That he created he brought this possibility into the access into the world.
Right. So is that what? That's what Abraham did with his mesirus nefesh.
Right. Correct. That's what we said before.
So he broke the ground, and he just by bringing the concept down to earth, right there.
Right. But what we're still maintaining that Abraham brings this down to earth, but he doesn't give it to everybody. We are his descendants. In fact, we have right here around the table two of his much closer descendants. Right. So. We as his descendants, we have a neshama, like it says in Tanya, we have a neshama b'Yerusha me Avraham Avinu. We have it as an inheritance from Avraham Avinu, and that's how each and every one of us have mesirus nefesh. So what we're saying now is, hold on a second, and this is going to come back to the question of ein mamash b'rishonim, of what is actually the pinnacle of Jewish mesirus nefesh, which is something that lahavdil, the terrorists and even Socrates have no access to. And what we're saying is that the difference between mesirus nefesh and Socrates is are you switching your popsicle for the roller coaster? Is this just searching for your own self fulfillment and pleasure? Obviously, it's a much more sublime way of having pleasure than having a roller coaster. But at the end of the day, it's what your human logical mind dictates, or is this an expression of the neshama which defies all logic? So we have a few minutes left. I want to read to you a few lines from the Alter Rebbe in Torah about Purim, where it talks about mesirus nefesh, and then hopefully tie this all together. It says the Alter Rebbe, we see that all the entire duration of the time that the Jewish people were in a danger because of the decree of Haman, this lasted almost a year, because the decree was around after Pesach time, and around Pesach time, and it wasn't to be fulfilled until the following Adar. They were in a status of mesirus nefesh every day, and at every time, every hour, at any given time, they were prepared, they were ready to give their lives to be killed, not to deny the Torah. Nobody even entertained the notion. This was certainly beyond what logic could dictate to them. The true pinnacle, the true definition of mesirus nefesh is something which is higher than logic, which defies logic. Even somebody who actually gives his life, he actually was killed for Kiddush Hashem. If his intention is to receive or to get something, to receive some reward or similar, this is not true mesirus nefesh. He hasn't given his life, he's going to earn tremendous earnings. This can be compared. People, quote unquote, give their lives, meaning people put themselves in very precarious situations in order to earn tremendous amount of money or to get a tremendous amount of honor. Okay, the Alter Rebbe continues there. I'm going to move on to reading a few lines here from the Tzemach Tzedek, where he specifically ties this back to the Akeidah. Over there it says that there's also in the Purim Mimer, where he says that there's the love of Hashem that comes Ki Hu Chayecha. Why do you love Hashem? It says in the pasuk, you love Hashem Ki Hu Chayecha. Hashem gives you life. You love yourself. That means you love your own life, right? So b'meila, you obviously, once you recognize that your life is an expression of Hashem, so you're going to love Hashem. But he says the mesirus nefesh, your lahash l'chayv meneged, to give your life away, nimshach. That's so if you're loving Hashem because He gives you life, so then you're not going to give your life for that. So the idea of mesirus nefesh, nimshach shaloim and pardon man b'muhusav atzmusi yisbarach shalomayim v'chinesuim kalam and m'mail kalam and nikra ki hu chayecha. It comes from the idea that the neshama doesn't want to be separated from the level of from Hashem on a much higher level than Hashem. Your life comes from what we call in Chassidus memali kalam and seidu kalam, and from those levels within seidu hishtalshalus. But here it's your connection to something much higher than that. This is the idea that Avram put Yitzchak. Where did Avram place Yitzchak? Again, coming back to the Akeidah, that Avram is putting Yitzchak, having mesirus nefesh by placing Yitzchak on top of the wood. What's the significance of him placing him on top of the wood? Ki eitz hachayim, the wood, eitz reminds us of eitz hachayim. What's the idea of life, of the eitz hachayim, the tree of life, the eitz, the wood, the tree of life? What's the eitz hachayim? If you eat from the tree of life, it says in Parshas Bereshis, he'll live forever. So eitz hachayim represents life, living. The idea of mesirus nefesh is that my connection to Hashem is a lot deeper than the fact that Hashem keeps me alive. And that's why Yitzchak is placed above the eitz, above Mimala eitzim. Like it says when Moshe sends the Meraglim to check out the land of Israel, he says, go and check if there's an eitz over there. The Zohar explains, if there's no tree there, what does it mean check if there's a tree or if there's no tree? There's no tree, ayin, that means that you're coming into Eretz Yisrael, you're going to access something much higher than the eitz hachayim, which gives you life. And this mesirus nefesh is the bittul hayesh la'ayin, the complete nullification and subjugation of self. So, to summarize all of this and to tie together what I believe are the remaining loose ends, what Chassidus is telling us is that, of course, there's the basic level where a person recognizes that whatever it is, in this case, remaining loyal to Torah and to Hashem, is more valuable than being alive. And while we say that's amazing, but there's also a part of us that tells us at the end of the day, you're switching the ice cream for the roller coaster. By the way, and just for the record, I think ice creams are much more enjoyable than roller coasters. And certainly you don't have ice cream before the roller coaster. But, right? True mesirus nefesh is something where, and this comes back to the fact that Avraham Avinu, his true pleasure is not because my son survived, but it's because I got to fulfill the mitzvah of Hashem. True mesirus nefesh dictates that there is something intrinsic which cannot be described in logic, in thought, in feeling, in understanding. It's just an intrinsic connection, an intrinsic enmeshment that the neshama has with the essence of Hashem, and mesirus nefesh is the manifestation thereof, and that's what the Akeidah is. When we say that Avraham Avinu was pesach the tzunor, that he brought into the atmosphere and he gave Yerusha as an inheritance to every Jew and neshama, which doesn't want to and is not able to separate itself from Hashem. What we mean by that is that we have, as a yid, we have the capacity not just to give our lives for whatever pleasures and rewards we're going to get in the world to come, but that we have the capacity to give our lives without any logic and without any reason and without any calculation that quote unquote makes sense, just because we are one with Hashem. And that is what we mean when the Gemara says, Ein mamish b'rishonim. Without the Akeidah, we could have looked. Let's look at let's use the first of the 10 tests as the example. So we have on the one hand the Akeidah, and Hashem is saying if Avram doesn't pass the test of the Akeidah, then the test of Ur Kasdim is going to be accused by the naysayers of being of no substance. What we mean by no substance is not that it's no substance at all. We mean within this idea of mesirus nefesh, of giving your life beyond rhyme and reason. The nisayon of Ur Kasdim is not like that. What's going on by Ur Kasdim? Avram is the rebel. He is breaking away from a society of paganism, and he's saying, actually, the truth is monotheism. Now, he's confronted to a debate. And Nimrod tells him, I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. So Avram Avinu, so you could have thought, and again, without the Akeidah, we could still, 5,000 years later, turn back to this and say, 4,000 years later, turn back to this and say, you know what? Avraham Avinu and Socrates belong next to each other. They both gave their life to make a point. To make a point that monotheism is true and paganism is false. We would have still claimed, or we may have made the mistake to think that Ein Mamash B'Rishonim, that Avraham Avinu giving his life in his debate with Nimrod and to be thrown in the fiery furnace is comparable to Socrates, who gives his life to make a point to the world that monotheism is the truth. But comes the Akeidah, and the Akeidah shows us that that Avraham Avinu is something completely different. The Akeidah doesn't make any point. It's just to fulfill the will of Hashem. Nobody's going to know about it. If they do know about it, it's going to be even worse. Here you have the individual who spends his whole life to promote monotheism and to take the world away from pagan practices, and he goes and does the most pagan practice possible to kill your own son for your God. So not only was Avraham Avinu overcoming the test of the Akeidah, not promoting his agenda, on the contrary, he was shooting himself in the foot. He was undermining everything that he stood for. And therefore, once Avraham Avinu passes the test of the Akeidah, we can no longer make the mistake of saying Ein Mamash B'Rishonim. We can no longer make the mistake of saying that Avraham Avinu's mesirus nefesh is a product of rhyme and reason and logic. Rather, we are now forced to face the reality, so to speak, that Avraham Avinu's mesirus nefesh is in a whole different caliber. Let's finish off by reading a few lines from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. In chapter 1, Siman Aleph, Sif Yod, Toiv Loim Parshas Akeidah B'chol Yom. Toiv Loim B'chol Yom Parshas Akeidah. It's appropriate to recite the Akeidah every day. K'dei lizker zchus obvious lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to remember the merit of our forefathers in front of Hashem. V'gam, and also k'dei lachnia Yitzroi lavid Hashem Yisbarach, to subdue your own inclination to the service of Hashem. Blessed be He, K'moshe Masa Yitzchak Nafshay, as Yitzchak gave his life to Hashem. Okay, that's the end of the relevant piece of that sif. So we're saying the Akeidah all day, not just to say how amazing Avraham Avinu was, but also to remind ourselves that we should live in that way. And finally, 2 lines from the Sefer HaChinuch. I've quoted the Sefer HaChinuch, I believe, a number of times in this class. This is from Parshas Bahar, Mitzvah Shimon Lamed Aleph. The context is talking about the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And of course, we have numerous references in the Gemara and the Midrashim, and our Machzah is full of invoking the Akeidah, and it's all the language as always that Hashem should remember the Akeidah for us and be kind to us because of the Akeidah. But the Sefer Chinuch makes a little bit of a twist, and he says, "Shatkiya hahi," that blowing the shofar of Rosh Hashanah on the Eisim we do likvaya machshavteinu alinu Akeidah, to instill within us the reminder of the binding of Isaac. On Itzayer benafshenu, we should imagine lasis gambono, to do to ourselves kamoihu what Yitzchak did, what Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak did, la'avas Hashem, to loving of Hashem. This will cause that our memory should be brought in front of Hashem to the favor. What does that mean? That we should behave appropriately towards Him. So, beyond the Akeidah, invoking the Akeidah just being a sort of segula to reference, we say to Hashem, be kind to us because Avraham Avinu so many years ago did this, but actually what we're invoking with the Akeidah is more emphasizing and reminding ourselves that Avraham Avinu did this and thereby accomplished the Psichas HaTzinor. Avraham Avinu brought this into the atmosphere and made this available to every single Yid who has a neshama and is able to do the same thing. And therefore I start my day by reciting the Akeidah to remind myself that b'meshach, throughout this whole day and everything that I'm going to be doing this day in my life, I should be infused with the memory that actually the most important and the only important thing in life is doing what Hashem wants and not doing what Hashem wants me to not do. May we, Yitzchak Hashem, live up to it, each on our own level.